Welcome to tonight's segment of the Faculty Lecture Series. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Jess Galardi. I'm professor and director, and I coordinate these lecture series. So, thanks for attending tonight. Keep an eye out for the next lecture. We're going to take a slight break, but we'll return November, I believe, 3rd with Dr. Mann and Dr. Garcia from the School of Education. So tonight's event is presented by Dr. Karli Iceman, Assistant Professor of Counselor Education. Dr. Iceman is an assistant professor within the School of Counselor Education here. She received her bachelor's degrees in English, History, and Psychology from Oakland University. She also received a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling and her doctorate in counselor education and supervision from Oakland University. Prior to joining ASU, Karli worked as a counselor in private practice, where she worked with clients from various ages, backgrounds, and presenting concerns within the Metro Detroit area. The lecture tonight is going to be about exploring master level counseling students' lived experiences when taking online counselor education courses within the past 5 years, or ranging from 2017 to 2022. Traditionally, counselor education programs and classes are offered through in-person learning modalities. However, the increased movement and utilization of online learning in higher education has raised the question and application of online learning within counselor education. Although past research explored the efficacy of online counselor education, there is a limited amount of research available to students' experiences with training to become counselors in an online environment. This research stems from Dr. Iceman's dissertation seeking to fill this gap by using qualitative I'm going to miss that word. Phenomenological, I can get that one, approach to learn more about master level counseling students' experiences with taking their counseling classes through an online learning environment. Based on 13 participants' experiences, 4 categories emerged. Participants spoke of their positive experiences with taking online counseling classes, the challenges they experienced, and ways that they coped or adjusted with taking online courses, and how they felt that about their online counselor education and how it impacted their development. The findings of the study are intended to help provide counselor educators and counselor education programs with ways to better develop and implement online counseling classes in ways that promote student success. So help me in welcoming Dr. Iceman.
Thank you all for attending today, and I'm really excited to be able to share this research with you that I did for my dissertation, where I looked at students' experiences taking online counselor education courses. So to jump right in, I think it's really important for me to talk about some of the reasons as to what got me into this research. So from a very young age, I always had a passion for teaching. I knew that I wanted to teach in some capacity, and it was just a matter of finding a way to get to that path. I've always had an interest in the way that people learn. So when I was younger, I struggled with reading comprehension problems, and so through this experience that I had, I learned how to adapt the learning environment to my needs. So for example, while a lot of my peers were reading books just from a physical text, I was reading from the physical text while also listening to the audio. And I still do that to this day. Skipping forward into further in my education, in my undergraduate experience, so I went to an in-person institution. They did offer some online classes, and I had some mixed experiences. There were some times where the professor was really engaged, and there were times where I couldn't even tell you who the professor was or what they looked like. Moving into my doctorate program, I got really interested in instructional course design, and I became really interested in learning about how we can take in-person class materials and how to apply that into an online setting. Switching over, the pandemic happened. I was in the middle of my doctorate program when this happened, and I was not only a student at the time, I was also teaching, and I was practicing as a counselor. So there were multiple layers to this. So as a student, I would like to say I'm pretty organized, but when the pandemic hit, I realized that I was quickly disorganized and I really did not have that clear sense of grounding that I felt like I once had. I was really uncertain about the expectations. I was studying for my comprehensive exams and I had no clue what they were going to look like. I had no clue what my dissertation process was even going to look like. I was also concerned about the quality of my learning in the overall program. Was I going to walk away with the quality learning that I was desiring to have in order to be able to stand in this role that I have today? As an instructor, my first thought, especially coming from an in-person institution, was how is this going to work? We had less than a week to kind of figure out how we were going to switch everything that we did in person to an online setting. Because of the pandemic and everything that brought about, students had a lot of concerns. They were talking about their mental health, they were worried about their family, and so I found a lot of my role was just sitting there and listening to them and just sharing that space with them. They also shared concerns about the quality of learning. As a practicing counselor, too, I had no previous training on providing telehealth services. I had only done in-person sessions face-to-face. And one of the biggest concerns I had was how were my clients going to respond to online telehealth counseling? So through all of this, I started thinking about, can online learning be a sustainable long-term solution to counselor education and overall higher education? So this sparked my interest in looking into this area. And so what I found was that distance education or online education has been utilized since the 19th century. And that in fact there's over 6 million students that have taken at least one online course. In counselor education, traditionally, we've taught our courses in person, face-to-face. We've really emphasized that, especially when it comes to developing a rapport with clients. With that said, there's been this new shift into providing online classes and online counseling programs. And then with the pandemic, it really made us start to think about, can we teach these classes in an online setting? And it brought up a question for me of what is good online learning? So I went into the literature and I started by looking at the development of higher education in general. So the development started back in the 17th century. A lot of these institutions that were formed were private and they were catered to white upper class religious men. And a lot of this was based on religion and social status. Changes started to happen within the 18th and 19th centuries with the American Revolution, especially because there were new jobs and skills that were available, such as medicine and law. There was also this change of there being public higher education institutions as well as community colleges. And then from there, there was this expansion to allow more people into the higher education setting, such as women, the African American community, and those who were lower middle class, so that way they could afford to get a higher education. From there, this continued to just grow even more into the 20th century. There was the ending of racial discrimination, the Higher Education Act of 1965, and then individuals with disabilities were now recognized within the higher education setting. Changes continued into the 70s and 80s with the privatization of higher education, the decrease in federal funding, and this led to the increased tuition costs and overall funding of what it takes to attend higher education in general. And this is still a problem that we see till this day. So then I looked at online learning in higher education. And there's been a huge evolution that took place, where it started from correspondence, so where you would mail in your assignments to your instructor, and it moved from the radio to television to what we now know today with the computers and internet. From there, there's been these changes in learning theories and pedagogies, and ultimately we've been trying to develop some best practices when it comes to online learning. I've broken it up into two categories: instructor course preparation, which entails making sure that they're receiving support from the institution, making sure that faculty members are trained on how to provide classes in an online environment, and then overall course delivery and design. And then the second part is online classroom environment. So how do we still go about fostering relationships within an online setting? Especially because in a face-to-face setting, it's very easy to turn over to your neighbor who's sitting right next to you to be able to chat and have a conversation. Being able to provide feedback, it's so critical that students need feedback, especially because they do not have that face-to-face interaction. Establishing classroom expectations. And this is kind of funny, but during the pandemic, one of the expectations I actually had to set for some of my students was, don't come to class in your PJs, you got to put on clothes. And then technology support, making sure that students were able to have the equipment that they needed in order to be able to take these classes online. So there's a lot of debate about the efficacy. And through looking at the research, I found that online learning can be just as effective as traditional in-person learning. And when looking at the experiences of students, there's a lot of benefits as well as challenges. And some of those benefits are the accessibility to attend class, especially if you are working and you have a family. Being able to have these online classes makes it a little bit more feasible that you can do your coursework at a time that's a bit more convenient for you. That kind of ties into the flexibility of attendance. And then the active learning environment, where you have to be on top of your learning in order to be successful in the course. Some of the challenges came from the technical difficulties. I know that many of us in this room have probably experienced a frozen Zoom meeting where the person is there or you can't hear them. Managing the life distractions. So you may be trying to work on your assignments and you may have kids or pets or chores that just kind of come in the way. And then that missing social connected piece. Again, it's something that you have to be very intentional about when you are working in an online environment. So then I looked at what this looks like in counselor education. So to give a little bit of a background, the American Counseling Association was developed in 1952, and throughout this time, we can look at our most current codes, which is the ACA Code of Ethics in 2014, and we can see that there's standards that outline the use of technology within counselor education and within supervision. Then we have the Association for Counselor Education and Supervision, and they are dedicated to providing standards of quality counselor education and supervision best practices. So they developed a list of best practices regarding how to go about providing online counseling courses. And then we have the Council for Accreditation of Counseling and Related Educational Programs, also known as KCREP, which is an accreditation body for counselor education programs. And they have a set of standards where there are 8 required core areas for counselor education curriculum. I looked into the efficacy of this again, and I found out that online learning and counselor education can be just as effective as traditional in-person teaching in counselor education classes. And from the students' experiences, I found out again that they really like the flexibility of this. They really liked the fact that they could still hold jobs or take care of their other responsibilities while still being able to pursue their career of becoming a counselor. Some of the things that they also talked about were these factors that helped satisfy their overall experience and made them successful, such as being motivated, being self-disciplined, being able to engage in time management. And then what they really appreciated was having the instructor be really active in the online learning environment and then provide that quality feedback. So then I looked at COVID-19 and how that impacted counselor education. There were a lot of concerns from instructors. For the most part, knowing that a lot of counselor education programs are provided through in-person instruction, they had a lot of concerns about the limited training and support that they received when it came to now having to switch to an online learning environment. They also were concerned about the reliance of technology, and they were concerned about the quality of teaching. If I don't have the training to be able to teach online, how can I ensure that I'm going to provide quality instruction? From students, their concerns were having to manage a new learning style. For many of them, they were used to sitting in a classroom setting, listening to a lecture from an instructor. Now they were going to have to change what that looked like, whether that was if their instructor created a video or just provided a PowerPoint, or if it was up to them to learn the material. A lot of them also had concerns about would they be able to complete their educational programs knowing that there was a lot of uncertainty at this time. As I mentioned earlier, there's now been this shift where more counselor education programs are providing online classes and overall online programs. And so, can online learning be as effective in teaching skills utilized in helping professions? That's one of the big questions that we are still learning about to this day. So this is where I come in. So some of the problems I found were there was this movement toward online learning within higher education. There's also this movement in counselor education. It's been proven to be achievable because we have the proof of the pandemic. There was over 2 years worth where many of us were required to provide education through an online setting. With that said, there's a limited amount of literature that's available on the implementation, and there's a limited amount of literature that's available that highlights students' experiences. So my dissertation focused on learning more about these lived experiences of master's students when taking online counseling courses within the 5-year gap. So I looked at between 2017 and 2022. So I did a qualitative study where I focused on a social constructivist paradigm, and I focused on this universal truth and that knowledge is co-constructed. I also worked on transcendental phenomenology, where there's this emphasis on focusing really on the voices of the participants and bracketing my own assumptions and biases. Because I had experience as a student, instructor, and as a counselor, I wanted to be mindful that in this study, I was really focusing on their experiences. In order to do this, what I did was I kept a reflexive journal, I had a peer coder, and I also did member checking. So in order to collect the data that I did, I developed questionnaires. So I had a screening questionnaire to make sure that participants were eligible. I had a demographics questionnaire, and then I had qualitative questions where they focused on the advantages and challenges and the impact on counselor identity. And these were open questions, so I was able to capture their true voices rather than a closed question or a multiple choice question. From there, I did individual interviews. I did them through Zoom. They were semi-structured, so I had a list of questions, but I also deviated off of that in case there was something interesting that developed in their stories. They were audio recorded and transcribed, and the interviews lasted roughly between 45 minutes to 60 minutes. So I sought IRB approval from there, and then my recruitment was in order to get as much of a general understanding as possible, I sent an email invitation to all master level KCREP accredited counseling programs within the US, including Washington, DC. And what I did was I reached out to their administrative assistants, KCREP liaisons, and department leaders. What I also did was there is a counselor education and supervision network listserv, and I sent out my study on there, Again, just to connect with as many people across the country as possible. From there, I sent an email invitation to the participants where I provided a bit of information about me and the study. I provided them with an information sheet that went over more detail about that, and then I provided a link to the questionnaire for them to be able to take. And I gave them the option between if they just wanted to do the questionnaire or if they wanted to do both the questionnaire and the interview. So I did purposeful maximum variation sampling, again, to try to get as many voices heard from across the country as possible. The criteria I had was that they had to be a current master's level student or have graduated from a counseling program. They had to have completed at least one counselor education course, and they had to have taken at least one course online within the past 5 years related to counseling. So in total, I had 13 participants. It was very interesting to have participants because they really did come from across the country. I had some from the Northeast, I had a good chunk from the Midwest and West and South, and then a huge chunk from the West. So for the data analysis, I followed Moustakas' guidelines where I bracketed my assumptions and biases, and I engaged in oralization, where I highlighted significant statements that participants made about their experiences. I established them into codes, and then I organized these into themes, and then I organized these themes into larger categories. So for the trustworthiness of this, to help with my credibility, I triangulated the data. I had the peer coder, and then I engaged in member checking. So after I transcribed all of the interviews, I sent the participants their questionnaire and their interview, and I had them read it over to let me know if I was fully understanding their experiences, and they were able to provide me some feedback on that. For transferability, I provided a detailed description of my procedures and processes that I took. For dependability, that's where I had my peer coder come in hand, and I also compared my findings to the previous literature that I was able to find. And for confirmability, I had open-ended questions, and then I kept a reflexive journal. So the results of my study, I broke it up into 4 categories: positives of online learning, negatives of online learning, ways of adapting and coping with online learning, and the impact on counselor development. For the positives of online learning, a lot of the participants spoke about the convenience factor. They really liked how they were able to uphold their other obligations, such as being a parent, being a caregiver. They really liked how it was accommodating to that. They talked about how during their class periods, they were often given a break and how it allowed them to be able to multitask. They talked about using different electronic learning methods, such as audiobooks, or even just having a PDF version of the text. They really like not having a commute. So especially for those participants who attended classes within the city, they talked about how sometimes it would take over an hour to be able to get to campus and then to get home. So they really liked the convenience of being able to do class right in their home. They liked the self-paced of the learning in terms of if they had something going on, they could return to it at a different time to be able to complete their assignments. They also really talked about the things that helped make this a positive learning experience, such as having instructor support. So again, really having that active instructor be present in the online environment, having the classroom expectations. They talked about having a smaller class size. They really liked how the smaller class size helped make it more personable, especially because they weren't having those face-to-face interactions. And then they talked about how they were able to develop additional skills, such as problem solving. Some of them felt they became more disciplined because they were the ones who felt more accountable and responsible for their learning. And then the development of routine, so being able to kind of structure their days, making active time for their learning. Some of the negatives that they experienced, they really missed having those interpersonal relationships. What they really wanted was to be able to feel connected to their peers, knowing that they couldn't just easily turn to their neighbor in a classroom setting. They wanted to have more opportunities to hear from their peers and to be able just to really get to know them, as well as their instructor. They missed the experiential learning opportunities. What they felt like a lot of their experience was read the textbook and answer these questions, or take this exam, or do this paper. And they really wanted to be able to do things to apply their learning, whether that was practicing counseling skills, or doing role plays, or examining case studies. They just wanted to be able to take that knowledge and do something with it. They talked about the challenges of learning from home. Again, just having the home distractions made it hard for them. They also felt like they had more coursework in an online environment. And then with COVID, they talked about the transition. And they talked about how they felt like it was very unexpected, very sudden. And then for a lot of them, they talked about having to just learn how to navigate technology. Some of the ways that they adjusted to coping with an online learning environment, whether that was chosen or whether that was due to the pandemic, was creating a sense of structure. Many of them talked about how I wake up at this time, I work on my homework from 9 to 4, and then I go and I do dinner and I go to bed. So they were very clear about how they had to literally schedule their time in order to make sure that they were keeping up with their studies. They talked about being proactive in the learning community, so they really liked it when they had opportunities to have like a conversation corner and like their discussion boards where they could have these informal conversations with their peers and with the instructor. And then they also talked about having to reprioritize their roles. Some of them talked about how they had to kind of negotiate the role between how much involvement can I be in this role and in my role as a learner. And then a lot of them talked about resilience. They talked about how they struggled, but they were able to continue to persevere. And then in terms of the impact on counselor development, a lot of them talked about how they felt that having to learn in an online learning environment helped them become more prepared for telehealth. They saw this as a great opportunity to be able to provide more counseling services to people from across the state, especially for individuals who may not have reliable transportation to be able to come to an office. Some of them talked about how they felt like it was a disruption to their development. They were still kind of not quite sure if they were fully developing to their full potential because of this disruption. And then a lot of them just talked about the uncertainty. A lot of them said, I'm not quite sure, I'll get back to you once I have more experience within my program. So this leads to the discussion of the findings. So a lot of the findings were consistent with what I found in the literature that is available regarding counselor education and helping professions in general. My study also added to the literature by talking about how students like to be able to multitask due to having breaks, especially in the online setting where they may have like a 15-minute break or maybe even a quick half-hour break in between classes. They talked about how they were able to learn new skills such as being self-disciplined and developing that sense of routine, resiliency, and then the implications on counselor development. So the implications of this study, I wanted to talk about the considerations of counselor educators. So overall course design in terms of experiential activities, this is something that really needs to be integrated within online educational settings, especially in counselor education programs, where a lot of what we do is very interactive. We need to be able to establish strong relationships within our online learning community, meaning that as instructors, we need to make ourselves very active and present, and we need to model that for students so that way they can also be present within the environment. It's also helpful to establish clear classroom expectations for online learning. Some of the common expectations that I found in the literature were how to write an appropriate discussion board, whether it's okay to include slang or smiley faces and emojis. And then being able to provide that quality feedback. And they talked about how they really wanted it to be full of depth and they wanted it to be timely. I then talked about the considerations for counselor education programs, how if we are going to be moving forward with online learning, we need to be able to integrate the use of technology in all of our classes, whether that's fully online or hybrid or in person. I talked about how it's important for instructors to be trained on how to provide teaching in an online learning environment, how it's recommended to have small classroom sizes in order to create more of a personable space. And then the consideration of offering classes in different learning formats in order to accommodate students' various needs. I then talked about the considerations for students. And what I found was it's really important to establish relationships and connections, to be able to understand what an online learning environment looks like and what is expected, and then to consider the costs and benefits of it, such as being able to accelerate through your classes if they do have that option in your program, and how that may allow you to be able to complete your program faster, to be able to get out in the field. I think with any study, there's limitations. So generalizability, that's one of the big ones. So I only looked at the experiences of individuals prior or between 2017 and 2022. So I don't know about the experiences of those prior to this time frame. I also don't know about what students' experiences are like at the beginning of their counseling programs, especially if they are in an online learning environment. The impact of COVID-19, that's also another limitation. I couldn't separate how the pandemic had an impact on students' experiences. And then the credibility. So for my member checking process, I had 5 of the 13 participants respond to me and provide me feedback, but I tried to strengthen this through the triangulation of data and using a peer coder. So where do we go from here? Some of the things I've been thinking about are students and like how they perceive online learning as impacting their counselor development. I also thought about looking at doctorate students' experiences and if there's any similarities and differences between their experiences. I also think it's important to look at instructors' experiences about what it's like for them to be able to teach online counselor education classes. Are there any benefits and are there any challenges that they experience? And how do they view the overall coursework? Kind of tying this back into what my participants said, they talked about how the coursework they felt like increased from being in an online environment. So it would be interesting to kind of learn about their views about coursework, how they integrate experiential learning opportunities, and how these experiences look across different learning modalities. Thank you all for being a lovely audience and listening. So if you have any questions, please feel free. Yeah.
So I'm curious, one of the quotes you had on the right-hand side talked about online education being better or maybe more enjoyable because it kind of eliminated all that extraneous stuff.
Yes.
I think extraneous was the word they used. And then in the next slide, you talked about how, one of the potential negatives could be that it lacks that opportunity to develop kind of social networks and the soft skills, which would seem to be so important for counseling, right? Counseling is all about interpersonal communication and being able to read sort of effective cues. So how do you, as someone who's studied this a lot, how do you kind of in your mind reconcile that the positive of, yeah, they're you don't have to worry about getting to class at a certain time and dealing maybe with your peers in that particular space, but at the same time, given this professional training, you kind of want some exposure to that. How do you kind of navigate that?
Yeah, so I think one of the important things is to consider is kind of the students' motivation or intentions, because some of them may just be focused on just getting through the program, while others of them are really focused on taking their time, really trying to get to know people within the community. And so, and I remember that quote of how that quote that you mentioned. And when I asked that participant further, it kind of sounded as though it was just more of the logistics in terms of like having to get to class if you have a long drive, or having like in classrooms where you may have like a couple of minutes where you just kind of chit chat, you know, just talk about like how the day is going. You may talk about the weather. This student in particular, or participant in particular, kind of talked about how it eliminated some of that. They felt like they were able to focus more on the learning element of it. Yeah.
Do you think this movement towards online learning enabled counseling programs to be more accessible to people with different types of situations?
Yes, definitely. I can speak from our program here at Adams that we have students from across the country, and I have students in various time zones, and a lot of them have expressed to me that had it not been for having an online counselor education program available, they would not be able to become counselors. It just would not be feasible given the other things that they have.
Now it's not sort of forced, it's happening naturally because it's available since COVID.
Yes.
Do you find, and especially having done what you've done, that you do build in sort of time at the beginning to teach how to be a student in an online environment, that you do create time for chit chat, you basically deal with the issues that you saw, and does it then become a much better scenario than the one that was existing back during COVID?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there has been a lot of changes since then, and you're right in terms of it has made a pretty big difference. So I can speak from like my own classes. What I've done is I've created an instructor video at the very beginning of the semester where students just get to kind of know me and all of my quirks. And then I kind of talk about the expectations I have of them as students. And I also leave the open dialogue of what are some of the things that you need in your learning environment. And so, for example, this semester, one of the things that students mentioned to me was we wanted to be able to have that space where we could have like our informal conversations. So I was able to create that. And it's a pretty active space. Pretty much every day someone's posting about whether it's about the class or if they saw like an article and they're like, hey, I know that this peer mentioned it. I just wanted to extend the resource.
Nice. And do you find that, so, and do you do much with Zoom, or is it all sort of more blackboarding type?
So I do use Zoom in my classes.
And so do you create smaller breakout groups for them and just allow them the space to do whatever they need and not necessarily monitor it? What goes on?
Yeah, so when I've taught, especially larger classes, so by larger I mean probably about like 25 or so, I do break them up into smaller groups where I give them enough time where I usually have them work on something, but I incorporate enough time in my lesson in order to give them that space where they can just kind of check in with each other.
And what do they report back about?
They really like how they're able to feel that sense of connectedness. They feel as though they're able to really relate to each other when they are able to have that space. And then just from the learning element of it, they really like being able to have conversations with a variety of different peers because I mix up the groups so that way they can have different perspectives. Yeah.
So with the feelings of like, more work and all that, Do you think that is a little misguided because of how much the pandemic interrupted our lives and having to really create solid boundaries? Like if you wanted to be successful, right, you have to create solid boundaries of time. And I was just thinking back, reflecting, trying to teach in all of this, and how it did feel like, yeah, there was suddenly a lot of work, even though I was cutting a lot of the coursework, but it just felt that way. But until I developed those personal boundaries of time and routines, then it's like, oh, this is like terrible. As much of a terrible experience having those.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. I think the pandemic definitely had an impact on that. I think that a lot of students and faculty and just the general public were having concerns about a lot of different things. And so it may have felt like it was a lot more work to them. And I think, too, in terms of it may also just be like a perception change. This is something I've just been thinking about, where if you're able to go to a physical class setting and you're able to have a lecture for like 3.5 hours, for example, that's what I had at my institution. It may feel like it's less work because you're sitting there and you're absorbing the information. Whereas like in an online setting, you may have to watch a video and take notes, or you may have to read through the PowerPoint. So I always wonder about how students perceive it. Even though it may not even be more work, it's just the mindset of it, if that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead.
Just because my background is in identity, so I'm always curious on the resiliency type stuff. So did anything like pop up identity-wise with things like, and these may have been like sub themes of imposter syndrome or self-efficacy, either ebbing and flowing over time. Did that pop up when you were doing your interviews and questionnaires?
A little bit. I would say for more of the participants who are a little bit further in their program, I heard more of that. I would say a majority of my participants, though, were still pretty early on. And so that's where the uncertainty piece came in terms of they're not quite sure about how this would kind of like impact them. Some of them even talked about how like I really have nothing to compare it to.
One more. Do you have sort of training within the department for delivering online courses now? Do you get together to sort of figure out what best practices are? Because you're obviously delivering online and it's obviously working. So do you sort of help each other to get better at this?
Yeah, we do. I would say it's through like more of an informal process where I may stop at a colleague's office and kind of have a chat with them and get some feedback with them. But I know that when I was brought to Adams State, I did have to take a training about how to teach online. Yeah.
I just have a comment. You might know this already, but Adams State actually does still do correspondence classes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, people in prison are
Oh, that's
often
right.
not allowed to access computers or anything like that. So the only way to do it is actual mail and the way they were doing back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, you have to utilize the resources that you have, and if you don't have access to it, or maybe you're not supposed to have access to it, you have to find the alternative means. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.